Picture this. You've just lost everything you thought defined you. Your marriage. Your home. The version of your future you had been quietly building for years. And in the wreckage of all of that, with a child growing inside you and no clear direction forward, the only place left to go is a house you haven't set foot in since you were 10 years old. A house that has been sitting empty at the edge of a forest for decades, waiting in the particular patient way that old houses wait, like they know something you don't. That is exactly where Elena found herself. And what she discovered inside those walls wasn't just dust and faded memories. It was a secret her family had buried so deep that it had survived 70 years, 2 generations, and every attempt the world had made to erase it. A hidden room. A locked box. A letter addressed to her by name, written long before she was ever born. And behind a wall painted red, a voice from the past that would change the entire direction of her future. This is the story of what happens when the past refuses to stay buried. And what happens when a woman who believed she was broken discovers she was built for exactly this moment. Elena Brooks had not planned to come back. Let's be clear about that. Coming back was not part of any plan she had made. It was what happened after the plans collapsed. After the silence of a marriage that had slowly stopped working grew louder than anything either of them knew how to say. After the divorce. After the specific and hollow grief of standing in rooms that used to be yours and feeling like a stranger in them. After finding out she was pregnant and realizing that the future she was carrying had no shape yet, no foundation, no place to land. She was not running toward the house. She was running out of options. And the house, her grandmother Margaret's old cottage at the edge of the trees, empty now for years, left to her in a will she had never thought much about, was simply the one place left. She drove there on a day when the sky couldn't decide between overcast and raining, which felt appropriate. The town she had grown up near looked the way towns look when you've been gone long enough that they've changed just enough to feel unfamiliar without being unrecognizable. She passed the junction with the old pharmacy. The school with the same fence, now rusted. The road that narrowed into the tree line. And then the house appeared at the end of the lane, and Elena's hands tightened on the wheel. It sat the way abandoned things sit, with a kind of stubborn dignity underneath all the neglect. The shutters had warped with years of weather. The roof carried a thick layer of leaves and moss. The garden, once tended with the particular attentiveness of a woman who believed that what you plant matters, had gone fully wild. Vines had claimed the lower windows. The porch steps creaked under her weight in a way that made her think twice before trusting them. But the door opened. Old wood, resistance, and then air that smelled like dried lavender and thyme. She whispered to the empty room that she wouldn't stay long. The house did not respond with words. It responded with the sound of floorboards settling beneath her step, and something in that sound, weighted, deliberate, almost like a sigh, made her feel, absurdly, like she had just been recognized. She lit a fire that first evening the way she remembered doing as a child, watching the flames fight through years of settled ash before finally catching, filling the front room with warm, unsteady light. She sat on the same couch from her childhood, which had sagged further into itself over the decades, and held a cup of tea in one hand and her belly in the other. She did not cry. She had passed through whatever phase of grief produces tears and arrived on the other side in that flat, numb territory where feeling too much becomes feeling almost nothing. Just the fire. Just the weight of the baby. Just the ticking of the grandfather clock that definitely had not been ticking when she arrived. She heard the sound from upstairs around midnight. Not the random settling of an old structure. This was rhythmic. The measured back and forth of something moving in a room where nothing should have been moving. Elena was not a woman given to panic, but she was also not foolish enough to ignore what her body was already responding to. She picked up the flashlight, stood and went to the stairs. Her grandmother's bedroom was at the end of the hall, door slightly open, the air inside noticeably colder than the rest of the house. The floral wallpaper she remembered peeled at the corners. The vanity with the cracked mirror stood where it had always stood. The quilt on the bed was one she hadn't seen since childhood. And on top of that quilt, in an envelope too crisp and too centered to have been there by accident, was a letter addressed to her. Her name in her grandmother's handwriting. Elena's hands were shaking by the time she got the envelope open. She knew the handwriting the way you know the voice of someone who shaped your early years. Not because you've thought about it recently, but because it lives in a part of you that never forgets. The letter was short. It told her that if she was reading it, life had brought her back, just as Margaret had always known it would. It said there were things Elena had never been told. Things Margaret couldn't say while she was alive. It said she had done what she needed to do to protect the family, and now it was Elena's turn to understand. It directed her to the sewing room. It closed with the kind of love that doesn't need explanation. The sewing room had always been locked. Margaret's explanation had always been the same, just old things, nothing interesting. Elena had accepted that the way children accept the closed doors of adults without question, because questioning was not yet in her vocabulary. Now she stood in front of that door as an adult with a flashlight and a letter and no more tolerance for closed doors, and she pushed it open. The room smelled like old fabric and wood. Shelves of buttons and thread and folded cloth. The accumulated patience of a woman who worked with her hands. But what pulled Elena's attention was the wardrobe in the far corner, slightly tilted, out of place in a way that felt intentional rather than accidental. She crossed the room and opened it. No dresses. No linens. Just a back panel that gave way with a soft click when she pressed it, revealing a hidden compartment just deep enough to hold one thing. A small wooden box. Old, sealed with a lock shaped like a rose. And before Elena had time to process what she was looking at, her hand was already moving, reaching for the necklace she'd worn since childhood, a silver chain with a pendant she had always thought was just a pendant, heavier than it looked, handed to her by her grandmother without explanation when she was small. The pendant fit into the keyhole with the precision of something made specifically for this purpose. One click. The lid opened. What was in? Elena sat down on the floor of the sewing room and read for hours. What she discovered dismantled and rebuilt her understanding of her family in the same sitting. Her grandmother had not simply been a quiet woman who baked bread and hummed lullabies. Margaret had been part of a network, organized, deliberate, dangerous in the best possible way, of women who helped other women escape. Abusive marriages. Wartime blacklists. Unjust systems that gave women no legal recourse and no visible path out. Margaret had forged documents, changed names, hidden children, rebuilt identities from scratch. She had done all of it from this house. From the workshop of a woman the world saw as nothing more than a seamstress in a cottage at the edge of the trees. And Isabel, the baby in the photograph, the daughter Margaret had never mentioned to anyone, had been taken from her. Forcibly removed. A loss so total and so deliberately silenced that Margaret had buried it under decades of ordinary life, and the only place she had ever let herself grieve was in these letters, in this locked box, in this hidden compartment that no one was supposed to find until it was time. Elena sat with all of it. She breathed it in like air after a long time underwater. She felt the walls around her in a different way now, not as surfaces but as witnesses. This house had held all of this. Every secret, every name, every woman who had passed through and been helped forward. The silence her family had kept for generations wasn't the silence of shame. It was the silence of protection. And something in Elena's chest, some tightly wound thing that had been coiled since the divorce and maybe longer, quietly began to loosen. She had come back thinking she was broken. The house had been waiting to tell her she came from people who broke things on purpose. Chains, records, the silence that kept women small. But there was more. Because among the letters, a name kept reappearing. Isabel. Her voice surfaced in the final stack of correspondence, cautious, fragmented, written in the handwriting of someone looking over their shoulder. She had not been able to stay hidden forever, she wrote. He was still looking. She was sorry. And in the last line, scrawled at the edge of a torn envelope with the urgency of someone running out of time, behind the red wall. Elena found the shed at the far end of the property on a rainy night when she couldn't sleep. It sat half-collapsed in the overgrown garden, door swollen in its frame, the kind of structure that announces its own reluctance to be entered. She entered anyway. Past the tools and cracked jars and smell of mildew and rust, at the back of the shed, partially hidden behind the collapsed remains of an old wardrobe, was a wall painted in faded red. Unlike everything else in that shed, weathered, decayed, surrendered to time, this wall had been reinforced. Different wood. Different nails. Newer. Sealed as if by someone who understood permanence. Elena found a crowbar on the floor. 20 minutes of sweat and splinters and the resistance of something that did not want to be opened. Then a gap and then a room. Underground. Concrete. No windows. The temperature dropped the moment she stepped through, the specific cold of a space designed to be undetectable from outside. 2 chairs. A small table. Photographs pinned to the wall, women, children, each identified by a single first name, smiling with the careful happiness of people who have earned every moment of peace they can find. And in the center, under glass, a birth certificate. Isabel Ellery. March 3, 1952. And beneath the names, written in red ink in letters that seemed to understand their own gravity, "If you're reading this, you are the last of us." At the bottom of a file box on the floor, wrapped in cloth, was a tape recorder. Elena pressed play. The sound that came through was warped by decades, scratchy, fragile, the way voices get when time has worked on them, but it was unmistakably a woman. Soft, careful. Speaking to someone she could only hope would exist. She said she tried. She said he had found her once and she had run and her mother had helped. She said she couldn't stay hidden forever. She said the house knows. That it keeps you safe until you're ready to face it. And then, with the particular grace of someone who has accepted uncertainty, she said, I hope you are. I believe in you. The tape ended. Elena sat on the concrete floor in the dark with the recorder pressed to her chest and wept for every woman whose voice had been recorded only in places no one could find, every woman the official version of history had simply stepped over and continued. She wept for Isabel, who had been hidden so completely she had become a ghost in her own family. She wept for Margaret, who had carried that loss for the rest of her life and channeled it into protecting every woman she could reach. And somewhere in all of that, she wept for herself, for the version of her that had arrived at this house thinking she was the damaged one, the failure the woman life had set aside. When she climbed out of the shelter, the rain had stopped. The garden was wet and still. The kind of quiet that follows a storm. And Elena stood in that quiet and felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely identify, like she was standing on ground that was genuinely hers. She didn't come back here to hide. She came back to remember. To continue. To rebuild. The next morning she sat at the kitchen table with every letter spread in front of her like a map of something that had existed long before her and was waiting to exist again. She was not, she understood now, the end of this story. She was the next chapter of it. And the house, this house that had held so much, that had been so patient, that had arranged a letter on a bed and placed a pendant around the neck of a 10-year-old girl, knew that too. She started with the attic. Box by box, hour by hour, she pulled decades of carefully hidden documentation into the light. Medical records under false names. Letters in half a dozen languages. Photographs of women and children who had arrived with nothing and left with new names and new directions. The scope of what her grandmother had built was staggering. Not a single dramatic act of heroism but thousands of quiet ones, sustained over years, each one specific to a particular woman in a particular moment of danger. Margaret had delivered babies and forged birth certificates and fed people who were afraid to be seen in public and simply held the hand of every woman who needed a hand held. She had done all of it without recognition, without record, without asking for anything in return. And now Elena was pregnant and alone and standing in the middle of that legacy, and the only question was what she was going to do with it. She opened the east wing. The long closed section of the house that Margaret had always described as too cold, too damaged, not worth the trouble. When Elena pushed the door open, afternoon light came through the dusty window, hallway lined with small rooms, beds, bookshelves, folded linens, an old piano with missing keys. Not destroyed. Not beyond saving. Resting. Like the house itself. She worked for 2 weeks with the focused energy of someone who has finally found the thing they are supposed to be doing. She cleared vines and replaced bulbs and scrubbed floors and patched walls. She reoiled the wood until the smell shifted from mildew to something older and warmer. She worked with her hands the way her grandmother had worked with hers, quietly, purposefully, without needing anyone to notice. At night she sat by the fire and documented every name she'd found, every code, every fragment of the lives that had passed through. She didn't know what she'd ultimately do with the record. She only knew it needed to exist. That being forgotten was the last injustice, and she was not willing to participate in it. She stopped dreading mornings. She stopped reaching for her phone to check for messages from a man who was no longer part of her world. She started humming, small, unconscious tunes that she recognized after a few days as the same ones her grandmother used to hum while folding laundry. The house was no longer silent. And neither was she. The letter arrived on an ordinary afternoon with the regular mail. Handwritten, no return address, just her name and the house's name. Inside, no greeting, just a message. Someone had heard she'd opened the east wing. They needed somewhere safe, they and their daughter. Just for a week, the letter said. Inside. Elena read it twice. She felt her heartbeat change in the way it changes when recognition arrives. Not surprise, but the deep cellular acknowledgement of something familiar. She knew that feeling. That precise combination of desperation and apology and the hope that someone, somewhere, might say yes without asking too many questions. She had felt it herself not long ago. She sat down at the desk in her grandmother's old office, took out a piece of paper and wrote back. No questions. No conditions. 5 words, you're welcome. When you're ready. That night she pulled open the desk drawer and found it full of letters addressed to Margaret from all over the country. Some formal, some barely coherent with emotion. Notes of gratitude. Single lines, we made it. She's safe. Thank you for letting me live. Elena sat with those letters for a long time and understood that she was not creating something new. She was continuing something that had never really stopped. Marissa arrived first, holding her daughter's hand at the edge of the property on a misty morning, eyes carrying the particular weight of someone who has been afraid for a long time and is not yet sure they're allowed to stop. Elena walked out to meet her. No clipboard. No intake form. She just said, "Come in. You're safe here." That night Elena made soup. Marissa washed the dishes. Her daughter colored on the living room rug. And Elena stood in the hallway and said quietly to the walls that she understood now. This was what all of it had been waiting for. Others came. A woman who had been living in her car with nothing but a trash bag. A woman named Dana who arrived midwinter with 2 children and the look of someone who has been making impossible calculations for months. A mother of twins. A young woman named Lily who didn't speak much the first week and then one morning showed up in the kitchen and made tea for everyone without being asked. They did not know each other. They became something to each other anyway, not family by blood but by the shared decision to begin again, which is its own kind of kinship. Elena did not call it a shelter. That word felt clinical, temporary, like somewhere you passed through rather than somewhere you landed. She called it the Ellery House for her grandmother, and she found the old letterhead Margaret used to write on, faded, elegant, with a small rose in the corner, and she updated it, digitized it, kept the rose. Because the rose was everywhere. Carved into the floorboard of the east wing. Etched on the box from the sewing room. On her grandmother's grave. It wasn't decoration. It was a signature. A continuous thread running through 70 years of quiet, determined work. She filed for nonprofit status with help from a social worker who had known Margaret. Within weeks, supplies were arriving, blankets, hygiene kits, prenatal vitamins, books. Local contractors came on weekends to work on the West Wing. Not for payment, but because someone's wife had stayed here in 1982. Because someone's aunt used to send letters to Miss M.E. with no return address. Because this house had been woven into more lives than anyone had fully counted, and the people who knew that weren't going to stand by while it sat empty. One evening Elena stood in the backyard under a clear sky with the porch lights behind her and laughter coming from the kitchen and the sound of children running through the hallway and music from an old radio playing something soft and unhurried. She stood there and felt, not relief, not gratitude exactly, but something more grounded than either. She felt anchored. Not in a relationship. Not in safety guaranteed by someone else. In purpose. In the specific gravity of knowing what you are for. She created a small ritual for new arrivals. A drawer in the office marked simply for you. Each woman could write a letter to herself, a promise, a prayer, a goodbye to who they'd been, seal it and take it with them when they eventually moved on. A piece of themselves from the beginning. Proof of the distance traveled. Then came the morning she found the photograph. Slipped under the front gate in an unmarked envelope. A black and white image taken from a distance, of Elena in the garden holding the box she'd found behind the red wall. No note. No name. Just the image itself, which said everything it needed to say without words. Someone was watching. Someone knew what she had found. Fear moved through her fast and cold. The kind that makes your hands go still and your thoughts go very quiet. She felt the familiar pull of it, the instinct to protect herself by becoming smaller, by drawing in, by running. Then her daughter kicked, strong and certain. And Elena stood up straighter. She burned the photograph. She sat by the fire that night a little longer than usual, holding the pendant her grandmother had placed around her neck when she was small, and she said quietly to the room, "I'm not hiding anymore. Let them come." Because the Ellery House was not a hiding place. It had never been a hiding place. It was a line drawn in the ground. A declaration that some women make quietly without announcement that says, "We will not disappear." Elena's daughter was born just after midnight during a storm that sounded like the sky making up its mind. Inside the house everything was calm. The women moved through the rooms with the coordinated ease of people who have learned to trust each other in the particular way you only learn by going through something real together. They were there, all of them, doing what needed to be done as if the house had been rehearsing this. No one disagreed. She named her Margaret Rose. Not from obligation but from recognition, because when she looked at that tiny face, fists curled tight against the world, she saw someone who had been prepared for something before she had even arrived. And like every woman who had come before her in this bloodline, she had survived something before her first breath. The house continued to fill. Not just with residents but with community, volunteers, teachers, doctors, midwives, women who had been through it and wanted to help someone else through it. The West Wing became a studio space. Sewing tables, writing desks, easels, laptops, a whiteboard covered in plans and goals and the names of places women were preparing to go. The attic held supplies for everyone who arrived with nothing. And the sewing room, once locked, once the keeper of the family's deepest secret, became a living archive. A photograph of every woman who had stayed. A page from their journal if they chose to share it. A small object left behind. Not a museum. Not a monument. Proof. Undeniable, physical, named proof that they had been here. That they had chosen to begin again. That they had not been erased. One summer evening Elena sat in the garden with Margaret Rose against her chest and watched fireflies move through the dark beyond the garden wall. She whispered to her daughter that the house had given her back her voice. And she would use it to make sure no one else had to lose theirs. The baby's fingers wrapped around hers. She didn't cry. She just looked up at her mother with the calm certainty of someone who has arrived exactly where they were supposed to be. A letter came that autumn, official and notarized, filed with the state. The Ellery House was now a recognized women's transitional sanctuary, under state protection and public funding. That night they put candles in every window. Not for celebration, for visibility. To say to anyone who might need to see it, we are here. We are not hiding. Elena kept a journal beside her bed. Every night one thing she was proud of. Some entries were small. Margaret laughed today. Some were enormous. Dana's custody hearing was approved. But one night she paused over a blank page and simply wrote, I am no longer the woman who was left. I am no longer the one who was broken. I am not what they did to me. I am what I chose next. By the following spring, photographs lined the hallway. Not of ancestors. Not of founders. Of women who had survived. Each one framed beneath two words, still here. Because sometimes that is the whole victory. Sometimes staying is the bravest thing a person can do, and it deserves to be documented. Elena had returned to that house as a woman who believed she was at an ending. She left every morning into a life she had built from the materials the ending had left behind. She had not avenged herself. She had not spent her energy trying to prove anything to anyone who had underestimated her. She had simply looked at what she'd been given, a house full of secrets, a family legacy no one had told her about, a pregnancy and a divorce and a bank account that wasn't comfortable, and she had asked what she was supposed to do with it. And then she had done it. She became what her grandmother had been, what Isabel had tried to be, what every woman whose letter lived in that desk drawer had been in their own way, someone who kept the door open. Someone who said you're welcome here before they knew your name. Someone who understood that the most powerful thing one person can do for another is simply to make space. To say you are not alone in this. You do not have to start from nothing. Someone was here before you and they left something behind, and now it belongs to you. The Ellery House was not built from money or influence or anything the world typically recognizes as power. It was built from women who refused to be erased. From a grandmother who forged documents by firelight. From a daughter who hid behind a red wall and left her voice on a tape recorder for someone she would never meet. From a woman who drove back to an empty house with nothing left to lose and found, inside its walls, every reason to begin. Some houses are made of wood and stone. Others are made of the people who refuse to disappear inside them. This one was both. If this story reached something in you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps stories like this find the people who need them most. And if you know someone who is in the middle of their own beginning, someone who needs to be reminded that where they are right now is not where they'll end up, share this with them. Because sometimes all it takes is one open door. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. I'll see you in the next one.